Okay, so I'm going to do a tiny Tuesday instead of a mini Monday, and we're going to do a baby deer pocket painting. Now the first thing I did was I masked out all the branches in the snow, and then I worked on his little eye. I put in some burnt sienna, and you see I've also masked out the highlight of his eye and a little bit of highlight around the bottom rim of his eye. Now I'm adding a little black. Actually, that might be burnt umber mixed with black, and put in some shadows in his little eye. And I'm using my zero brush, pointed round zero brush. And I'm just going to put him a little shape around his eye with that same dark color. And I'm using some lamp black here for his pattern that's right in front of his eye. It's almost like an eyebrow, but it's some sort of little dark pattern that he has on his eye. And we're going to shade in that top area. Next, while that's drying, I'm going to go ahead and wet his whole head. Once his whole head is wet, I'm taking a little bit of raw sienna, and I'm just dropping it onto that wet paper, blending it out with the tip of my brush. I'm using a number 2 pointed round brush for this. I'm just sort of spreading it around, letting the water do the mixing for me. And the areas that I want it to be just a little bit darker with some shadows, I'm adding a little bit more paint. Got a little too much right there, dabbed it up with my paper towel. Always keep your paper towels handy. And I'm just spreading out a thin wash of that sort of yellow-brown color. Now we're going to come down the front part of his face with the same color. And again, I wet the paper first, so we're doing wet on wet. Wet paint onto some wet paper. We're just getting that base wash down, that initial layer, the underpainting started, if you will, on his face. I'm mainly just trying to let the masking fluid on the trees dry before I do anything else. And so since his face really doesn't touch any of the trees masking fluid, I'm just doing him. So now I'm taking some burnt sienna and I'm just dropping it into where I want the shadows, right down the front of his face. He is a cute little deer, all curled up in the snow and sleeping. He is a late deer. I think Bambi was a late deer. He was born late in the season. But we are painting this one in the snow because it's Christmas and deers remind me of Christmas and I love baby deer, so that's what we're doing. And now I'm taking a little bit of that lamp black, a little bit of burnt umber mixture, coming down and doing the tip of his nose. It is really dark. And he also has a little pattern shape right beside of his mouth, above his lip. And we're going to put that in as well with that same color. And we're making the edges a little bit fringy. You want your edges to be fringy so it looks like fur. You don't want it to square off the edges. You want them to look organic. And I'm just taking a watery mixture of that black and burnt umber and putting it on the tip of his nose. I'm leaving a little highlight area right there. It's sort of a little U shape. And then I'm just pulling that color up the front of his face. And we're just going to separate his top lip from his bottom lip with a little Payne's gray there. You can just use watered down black if you want to. I just had Payne's gray on my palette and decided that was what I was going to use. And I'm just blending in some of these areas with a little bit more of that darker lamp black color, adding a little bit more to the pattern on the side of his mouth. He's starting to look like he's alive now. Now I am just going to cover his face with just tiny little hair marks using my number 1 pointed round. I'm not going to film all of that hair painting. Just keep in mind that you want the hairs to go all in the same direction. You want them darker where there's a shadow, so you would put them closer together or use a little darker paint, like mixing a little more black with it. And you're just going to go straight up his little face, getting those shadows in there. And there's what it's going to look like when it's finished. Now I've removed the masking fluid, and his highlight on the bottom rim of his eye is just a little bit too big. So I'm just going to go ahead, put some lamp black in there and just cover that back up. Later, I'll just put a little bit of white gouache down there to highlight it. Since I covered up the highlight with my paint, it's perfectly fine. Now I'm just doing a light wash of that brown, sort of like giving him a little makeup, making the highlight of his eye a different shape and a little bit smaller, adding a little bit more black to that pupil. And I'm just adding some more texture and some hair marks around his eye. And I'm doing it with a little bit thicker of that burnt sienna color, that reddish brown color, with less water, a little more paint, so it's a little darker, a little thicker. And I'm just doing my little tiny hair strokes out from that. And I'm just trying to figure out where he would have shadows, where he would have some pattern marks, and trying to put those in as best I can. I'm just darkening up that eye a little bit, right on the top where the eyelid would put a shadow across the top of his eye. Adding a little bit more color underneath his eye and blending it outward. And then we're just going to add some more hairs, some more detail around the eye. It's a lot of fussy work. This took me quite a long time. I wouldn't even count this as a pocket painting. It's actually 5x7. But I really wanted to do a deer, and I decided to share it with you, my process. So here we are, not exactly mini Monday, tiny Tuesday pocket painting. But it's okay. We can paint every day of the week, and we'll just name it something different. I really like how his head's coming out, so I'm taking some of that darker brown, putting in the shadows around his little ears. Also, he's got like dark markings right around the edge of the tips of his ears, so we're going to put those in and do some little feathery lines so that it's not just a straight line going down into the soft, fuzzy parts of his ear. And so we're going to put those in there with that dark color. I'm going to add a little shadow down the side of his face over here where he's holding it against his body, trying to stay warm in this cold weather. So now that's dry, I'm going to go ahead and wet the background. The masking fluid is dry. I'm going to be careful going around the deer's ears because that's the only thing that's sort of poking out into the wet area. So don't get the ears wet. Go carefully around them. Wet the whole background with clear water. And then I just took some indigo blue. It's one of my favorites for a snowy scene. Other people like to use cerulean or I don't know what other colors. I know I see a lot using cerulean, but I really love this indigo blue. It is an M. Graham company color. It's from M. Graham watercolors, and I just like the color of it. It reminds me of winter for some reason. So I'm just going to put that. I wet the background. I'm just dropping that into the background. I think I'm going to put a little more on my palette here. And I'm going to darken up some of the areas. So I'm going to add a little bit more of the paint and just right across the top there. And notice it's getting a little lighter as it goes closer to the deer. Then whenever we do the snow that the deer is actually laying on, I'm going to add a lot more water to the mix so it'll be a paler indigo blue because I want that to look a little bit different than the sky. Now I'm just dropping in some clear water so that I could get those back runs or flowers or cabbages. People call them different things. So I just dropped a few drops of water in there while it was still wet, and you see it's already working. It's making those sort of starburst up there in the sky. Or it's not really even in the sky, it's just in the distant background. So now I've got my watery mix, really watery mix of the indigo. Lots of water, not that much paint. And I've painted the snow, and now I'm making a little dark shadow underneath the baby deer. And just doing a few little lines through the snow so it's not smooth. Just give it some interest and some texture. We don't want the snow to be boring. And we're just going to let that dry just like that. It looks really good. I like that. And just darkening up this shadow a little bit more. And I'm bringing the shadow across underneath the branches, even though you probably won't be able to tell, but just in case you can see some of that underneath when we lift off the masking fluid. So now I'm going to wet his little body while we're waiting on that background to get dry. Be really careful. Try not to touch the background with the paint or else they'll bleed together, or you can just wait until the background's completely dry to do this step. Totally up to you. If you're not confident, I would wait for the background to dry and then I would wet his body. And once you wet his body, you can start dropping in that burnt sienna, a little burnt umber, and try to put the darker colors where you're going to want the shadows. Right now I'm just sort of spreading it around in some different areas where the burnt sienna will really show through. Now I'm adding some of the umber, the burnt umber, in some of the darker areas down his backside and where those branches are shading him just a little bit. And just adding a little bit more of the umber, and there's the burnt umber, and there's just into the shadows across his back where it's going to be the darkest, down around his little ear where his ear is putting a shadow on his back. So it's a little darker where the ear, it goes on top of his back. And I'm just going around. I'm leaving a few white spots because, of course, he's a baby. He's got little white dots on him. I don't know what they're called, but they're little camouflage marks. So now I'm just going to take some white gouache and drop that in there for his baby dots. I don't know what they're called. But for his little white pattern on his back, I'm just going to drop that into some different areas. Just use white gouache. You could mask those dots out if you wanted to. I want them to look a little more softer and blended into the fur a little more. So I'm just using white gouache while the paint is still wet, while that brown is still wet, and you can see the gouache is spreading out into the brown paint. But since it's thicker and heavier than the watercolor, it's pretty much holding its own pretty well. It's holding its own. It's not really blending with the brown. It's staying true to white, but it is sort of spreading out and mixing in there around the edges, which I think is a pretty effect. I'm going to put a little gouache around his nose here because he's got a little white area there. So now let's look up a little closer so you can see exactly what I've done. I am going to work on this ear. I'm going to darken up this tip of his ear just a little bit using some lamp black. I think it looked a little too gray when it dried. You know, everything dries lighter, so it's always best to work light to dark with watercolor. You can always darken it up. If it dries too light, you can always add another layer, so don't panic about that. Now I'm putting in some more fur marks, and they're darker. They're that darker brown right across his head, but I'm leaving that little highlighted area. I'm just going to go with that same sort of brown and go into his ears and just sort of highlight the little fluffy furriness inside of his ears. I'm just going to paint this outer rim of his ear too with a little bit of this darker brown. I'm leaving it pretty pale on the end though, like toward the background. And just give him some little fur sticking up into the background and around the edges. Now we're going to paint the fur, that light color sort of tan and white fur that's inside of his ear. It's really long and fluffy to protect those little ears against the cold. And I'm just using the same color that I've used for his body. And just making it really feathery along the edges, sort of solid in the center. And having some of the parts a little darker than others. And just add a little more paint where you want it darker while it's still wet. And feather some of those little wispy paintbrush strokes out. It looks pretty good. Now we're going to work on that other ear, do the same thing. We're going to work on the shape of where it goes into his ear, make that a little more solid, and then all the edges are really feathery, and the hairs in his ears are really long, a lot longer than the rest of the hair on his body, so we want to show that with some long hair-like brush strokes. Now we're going to add some shadows right along his back with that really dark brown. It's burnt umber mixed with lamp black. It's really a dark color. So we're going to get those in there. And I'm sorry, my camera keeps trying to focus on my hand and I want it to focus on the painting. But you can see what I'm doing, so it's not that bad, but I still apologize because I know it's very aggravating. And you just get those shadows in there and do it with little hairlines, little hair-like brush strokes. And I'm working my way around, separating some of the little spots, his little white spots, out from his body, going around them with the darker color so that they separate out. Now we've done his body, got all the sort of hairlines in there and separated out his little spots on his back. So now we're going to work on his leg. I'm using a really dark sienna, burnt sienna here, and just painting in his leg. And just maybe I brought that down just a little too much. We're going to put in some burnt sienna around his little tail. He's got his little tail curled around him. Now I'm just taking some clear water and blending those two areas together. I'm going to pull it down toward his face some more. He's starting to look like a real deer. That's a little light for me, so I'm just adding a little bit more color. And then I'm just dabbing just tiny bits out. And we're going to work on this leg, this haunch right here a little bit more. And you just add some fur marks in there. It's really the same technique over the most of the deer. You're just mixing different colors, wet on wet, and then coming back and adding texture with just little fine brush strokes that look like hairs. So the trick is really just to get your shadows where they're supposed to be, get his markings where they're supposed to be, and he'll come out okay. I'm just darkening up some of the shadows as I go where I feel like they need to be darkened up. And we're going to put a little shadow under his face here, under his neck. And start working on that area so that he looks like he's finished. This area is just screaming for some help. So we're just going to put a little burnt sienna in there, a little bit of burnt umber right under his chin to make the shadow. Also going to put a little splash of that on his tail, run some of it up his back, some of that burnt umber color just to darken up some areas and smooth it out some. Sort of knocks back those layers just a little bit if you come back over them with a wet wash. And just adding some more color here, blending it around with the tip of my brush. He's starting to look like a real deer now. And just add a little bit more color. Now I'm just going to add some fur marks to down the middle of his tail. I want them to be darker. He's got sort of a dark stripe down his face and down his back. So we want to get that on his tail too. We've decided it went all the way down his tail. Now I'm taking just a little more white gouache and I'm just working on these little white dots, brightening them up just a little bit. I'm just adding the gouache right to the top and just sort of blending it out around. Just brightening them up just a little bit. You probably don't even have to do this. It's just I wanted to do it, so here we are. Now I'm going to add a little shadow down his face. And then where his leg sort of curls under him, we're going to put that shadow in. And go across the top part of his lower leg and put a few little texture marks in into the shadows of his legs. Now we're going to darken that interior area up. That's where his tummy and his legs are all meeting right at the tip of his nose. So we're going to put that shadow work in there. And some more shadows right down here, right under his little chin. Just adding a little bit of that sort of sienna color, sort of yellow ochre almost, into it. Adding a few more shadows around the back side of his head, underneath that ear. Trying to get his markings to look like a baby deer markings. And I think we're accomplishing that pretty well. Pretty well. Darkening up some more areas. Using a little bit of that burnt umber in some areas just to darken it up and define it a little bit better. Now I'm just add some gouache on his bottom lip. I accidentally painted over it, so I'm just going to paint it back in with some white gouache. And his under chin, I'm going to add some white gouache to it. You know how they have those white chests sometimes underneath their neck, and their chest is white, so we're going to sort of paint in that little white streak, that little white shading there. And we're just going to add a little bit of shadow right here. Blend out that other shadow at the top. Add some texture marks. Starting to really come alive now. Starting to look like a little deer. Add some darker shadows with that darker brown. Right under his neck. Onto his little front shoulder. Add a little bit more of that golden yellow ochre color. A few more shadows, a few more little tick marks, a few more little hairlines, and he is just about alive. Well, I'm really happy with the way he's coming out, putting a shadow under his chin, and that sort of defines his little chin away from his leg there. And just putting some darker shadowy marks around the edges of his tail. Into some of those dots back there, a few little brown lines just to make it look like the fur is blending into it. Now I have taken off the masking fluid of the tree branches, and the branches have snow on them. I'm taking a little green gold, and I'm first just putting the green gold down onto some of the needles, going in with some sap green, a little hooker's green, a little perylene green, in different areas, just mixing the types of green, the shades of green up as I do the little pine needles of the branches. And I'm going a little darker under where the snow is laying on top of it, so it's a little darker green, like the snow is casting a shadow onto the pine needles. But really just blend up those different colors of greens into the trees. That looks really pretty. You don't want all one color green. You want to mix it up and be mindful of this little snow plops. I'm going to call them snow plops. Snow plops that are on top of the branches. You got to watch Southerners. They just make up stuff as they go. They just make up all kinds of words. And you want to pull those little needles out from under there. And you want it darker, closer to the snow plop. And we're going to work our way around doing each one of these little pine boughs the same way. I'm just going to do a little bit of the green gold and then come back in with some sap green, maybe some hooker's green or some perylene green, and just blend the different needles together, like do different colors of needles and just sort of layer them on top of each other, all around each other. Leave some of the needles white. May have some snow on it, you don't know, but could be. So think about that as you're doing your trees, and just avoid painting the snow. Leave it white. Just add some really nice fringy pine needles in there. And then just in some darker areas, put a little shadow. And so this is what it's going to look like when you're finished and have all your pine needles painted in. And you can come back. I'm adding a little white gouache to some of the snow plops because they look a little skinny to me. So I'm fattening up those snow plops with a little gouache, a little white gouache. And then I'm just going to take some of the blue that I used for the background and I'm going to mix it with my gouache and I'm going to add a little bit of shadows to it because we don't want it all just flat white. We want to add some shadows to our snow plops. I'm calling them snow plops, y'all. I can't figure out another word for them. So snow plops they are. So we're getting our snow plops fattened up first with our white gouache, and then we're just going to add some shadows. And I'm just going to do the shadow work with just a little tiny bit of that blue from the background mixed with the white gouache. We're just going to tap it in some different areas where you would think there would be some shadows. And that really brings that snow to life. It makes it not look just like flat white. Somebody just painted on there for no reason. Now it looks a little bit more like the snow with some of that blue shadows in there. And that's a really watery mixture of the gouache and that blue. And there you have it. You have a little baby deer in the snow. All right. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe and follow my channel for more just like this. Y'all have happy holidays.